you. So thank you very much, and thanks for inviting me to talk about basically how catastrophe models could be used in the future and today, actually, to increase our society resilience, and especially in terms of flood risk, because it's one of the key perils in Romania and in Europe and globally, I would say. I think flood risk is very well correlated with our built environment in our societies, and you can see that in many examples. One of the first examples, of course, the most obvious, is our increasing urbanization that really leads to faster catchment response in our river system, and of course, that water surface flooding in urban cities. This is we have seen some of the images, the videos we running on the beamer. That was sometimes very impressive. This is increasing. Another an example where this connection is very tight is linked with our economy, with the large industrial sites. Many of them, they are located close to a river system for obvious reasons. So there is an intrinsic correlation between the risk, the water, and the exposure in this case. And of course, the way we can protect ourselves against flood, and especially how the community or individuals can handle flood protection when there is an event. So all those different aspects actually can be investigated in a very new way, I would say, using Cad models. They could be very useful tools to do this, actually. So with that in mind, RMS, I just want to show you what we have done in terms of modeling over the past few years. I think Angelica mentioned that we have this kind of model now running with much more power and computing in the cloud and so on. So that's basically, I would say, the next generation of flood models that we have created there. It's basically covering now 15 countries in Europe. So we talk about Romania later in this discussion, because you see it's not covered for the moment there. That's a topic in itself. But what is really particular and basically unlocking new ways of using Cad models is the fact that we try to create more massive model, bigger model at continental scale, just to basically capture really the correlation across the whole territory. So that's one first element. It's very complex to do because it's becoming a very massive model to run. So can no longer run on your own computers in-house. You need to have more power to do that. At the same time, we try to preserve also the very high resolution of the modeling, because when you model floods, you need to go down to very few meters to be able to assess the risk, both in space, of course, the resolution, but also in time, because flood is not like earthquake. It's not something that's happening, let's say, in a few minutes. It could evolve with time. It's lasting days and days, and it's evolving in time. So modeling the time aspect is very important. So just to really understand what is basically implemented in that kind of new generation of models today is the fact actually that we model actually the complete flood processes, right? We don't really start modeling flood in the river system. It's a bit not the right approach. It's an approach we have been doing in the past, maybe a decade ago, because it was easier to do that, but we were just capturing a part of this flood risk, what is happening in the floodplain. Now we can really start with this new computing power, starting really by modeling precipitation. So in this case, for example, in this approach, we model, let's say, 50,000 years of realization of the next year realization to capture what could happen next year, if you want, in terms of precipitation over Europe. And you see we do that really in a very fine time scale, hour or days, let's say. And you will see in a minute why it's important. So it allows us, of course, to capture any kind of feature linked with seasonality, with seasons over the year, or with clustering, which is the propension of storms to happen in series, let's say. Once we have this precipitation modeling, which is very important to understand, is that now we can a terrain model where we can model basically the interface connections and how this water will interact with the surface. And you see in this from that perspective, a portion of this water actually will be evapotranspirated, so it means it's going back to the skies. We say in continental Europe between 40 to 60% of the water is never reaching the river system. It's just going back due to vegetation. A part of this water, and of course it's very relevant for Romania, may be stored in in terms of snow, right, and maybe released in the next spring or next season in terms of water. So this time component is very important. And finally, part of this water will be going in the surface, progressively saturate the ground, and in the end could lead to what we call the surface runoff that could end up in a river system, breach defense, and lead to inundation. So what you really have to keep in mind is that now we try now to really assess the complete process of flood modeling, really from the start to the end, and this is what could allow us to unlock new functionalities in the model in terms of managing resilience. For example, we can do very interesting things there. We can, for example, of course, with such a Cad model, produce events that never happened in the past. So it's expanding your knowledge based on the historia. But you would say that's the traditional use. The purpose of a Cad model is just to show me what could happen in the worst case, the tail risk, as we call it in insurance, right? Okay, it's still the case, right? But that's not really new. What is slightly new from that perspective is that now we capture correlation across the entire continent. So within different postcodes, but also you can now imagine that you can compute the correlation within a book of business in England or in France with a book of business in Poland, for example. It was not possible before because we have this kind of patchwork of model that was more or less connected. In this map, for example, it's pretty small, but you see that's a correlation between the city of Dresden in Germany and the rest of Europe. I have a bigger map showing that later today. We can compute as well as we model time, basically time component in flood, different definition of what a flood event is. And that's really relevant, especially in continental Europe, where we have long river system like the Danube, where flood is evolving with time, with days, and even sometimes with weeks. So in insurance, we need to define what a flood event is, and we can now basically very accurately model this definition in time in the model. So that's basically, I would say, the traditional use of a Cad model for the insurance. But what we can do actually is basically use those very advanced models to do something else than just pricing insurance or reinsurance. We could, for example, try to plug some different scenarios in those Cad models and understand basically how climate trends could translate into losses in a book of business. We can do also very interesting things, and this will be a bit of my focus today in terms of resilience management. Try to start to run cost-benefit analysis about flood defenses. Basically, is it really value to increase flood defenses at a certain place rather than buying insurance or reinsurance from that perspective? And that's really now unlocked, I would say, with the capabilities we have for modeling this complete flood processes there. So let's refocus on that, because that's very much linked with the flood resilience. Actually, at RMS, when we built this model, we had this concept in mind of total resilience. Maybe it's a bit too extreme. It's never total, but I think that's actually merging two different concepts. The first is really financial resilience, which is basically the financial protection insurance is offering. That's a risk transfer, very traditional way of using a Cad model. But we try to move to an additional component, which is touching a bit the physical resilience, which is understanding the impact of what we do in the ground, how this would translate into the losses and the insurance needs. So in this case, for example, we just focus on defenses. Let's explore a bit that deeper. And when we think about defenses, the first idea is to get an image and information about those flood defenses. And so what we have done is basically trying to understand where we have this information. And it's surprising to see that actually in Europe, it's very difficult to find a complete database of flood defenses along the main river system. If you look at the small maps on the top, it's pretty small, but you see actually all what is black is basically where there is some kind of record of flood defenses information somewhere that you can use to feed into the model. And I think England is probably the richest database they have, right? In Europe, usually, we estimate about 70% of this information is missing. So we need, as a first step, if we want to play around defenses impact on financial losses, we need to, of course, complement this missing information. And this makes a big difference. If you look in the city of Dresden, this 3D image we have done, you see the difference between defended and defended. Okay, we can just overestimate the risk if we just run it undefended. So at RMS, we basically developed some kind of a model, which is a probabilistic model of flood defenses using assumptions. For example, one of the basic assumptions is that if there is an exposure at risk in a city, it's likely that there is a defense in place, right? And we can basically find some relationship between the value at risk and the standard of protection of the flood defense in place. This kind of assumption could be used to create a flood defense, backtest with what we know, and understand if we can complement the 70% of missing information. It was really the first work we did. Once you have that, of course, then you can start to play around with those flood defense system. And just a very simplistic cartoon just to explain what we do there. Let's imagine you have an exposure at risk along a river system. So the very first risk that comes to mind is what we call a river flooding. So that's basically flooding coming from the river system. And the basic defense we have to basically protect that is to build a dam, right? To build the flood defense along the river. This flood defense is built up to a certain standard of protection. It means it sustains a certain flood height or a certain return period of flooding, if you want, right? And if this is exceeding, so if it is breached or overtopped, of course, this will lead to another flood defense. So the response to that is to build stronger standard of protection. This is what we call really the river defense standard of protection, or the SOPs. That's a basic flood protection system we have in place. Now, in places where we have also heavy precipitation and also mountains, like of course in Romania, we should not neglect that water can come for heavy precipitation. And this is what we call the pluvial defense system. And in this case, we have another way of protecting the exposure at risk in the model, which we called the property flood resilience, this PFR, which is individual building protection. It could be sandbags, temporary sandbags. It could be more semi-permanent system to close the doors or to close basically any basement, for example. So that's all what we need to protect this building. In RMS, actually, we can play around with both flood defenses. And we can start, if you can adjust that in the model, run different analysis to run this cost-benefit analysis, actually, which is pretty interesting things. And here I would just want to mention a bit, because Andy was talking about floodry. That's basically the work we do with them in the UK. The basic idea of floodry, of course, is to basically understand what is the impact of mitigation, both at community level and at individual risk property, right? To get really a more informed discussion with the politics, with the environmental agency about how to best invest budget and money, right, to protect homeowners in the UK. And of course, this is really the benefit from homeowners, for the society, for the economy in the UK, having more quantified discussion rather than a less political discussion, I would say. That's basically, I hope it's the right approach, and correct me if I'm wrong, but that's basically what is the use of these functionalities. So to make it a bit more real, I can show you a use case we have done for one of our clients, but okay, right before just how this is functioning actually in the model. If you take the flood river defense, you see that's the traditional incidence probability curve that you probably all know in your insurance industry. That's the traditional output of a Cad model that relates basically a certain return period of exceeding a certain loss threshold, right? And you see the dashed line, actually that's the loss distribution, this EP curve, incidence probability curve, for our default value assumptions of flood defense for a book of business. I believe this is in the UK. And so in the model, you can basically tune and let's decrease this standard of protection, so you make it more vulnerable if you want, and you see the curve. So for example, from the default standard, we move to something that is lower. This is this curve. We can even remove completely the flood defenses, so it's a total breach or absence of flood defenses, and you can get basically this curve in red, which is, I would say, when there is no fluvial defenses applied in the model. Oppositely, you can also increase standard of protection, and you get, for example, you can increase it by 50% or 100%, and you get this decrease in losses. You know, you see basically this is asymmetric. You will see that later today. It means that you need basically to invest more money to get a benefit from that perspective. You can even run the model, I would say, with an infinite standard of protection. It means that it will cover the risk for any cases over 50,000 years of simulation. but you still have a loss, as you can see there, because you still have this pluvial residual component there, right? So you never get no losses. There is still the loss coming from the rain, from the precipitations there. So if we apply that to a real case, how this could be basically used, so this is a work we did for a report where actually we had one industrial site in Germany that was flooded both in 2002 and 2013 and 2014. They decided to protect it, right? And they built the flood protection up to 100 years. And so they ask to run different scenarios if they need, for example, to invest more money or less money to get protected. What's the benefit, basically? It's the key question they have there. And so to do this, we run this site in what we called an industry facility model. So instead of modeling this site to one single location, we just modeled the individual buildings, because they have individual vulnerability. One building maybe the administrative building, another building maybe, for example, the production unit, the other one, the storage unit. So they have their own different model and curves. And of course, you see, if we run the model with the standard of protection 100 years, it's not flooded. That's the scenario there. When we run, we decrease by 20 years. So we mimic some kind of a bridge. It started to be, of course, flooded again. So it means the model actually is reflecting exactly this standard of protection they have. It's a good illustration. But of course, the idea is to run this with different scenarios, right? So if you look the results on the graph there, you see that's basically the average annual loss. So the average technical premium, if you want, you may need to pay for this site with the default standard of protection of today, 100 years. And you see basically that if you decrease by 20% the standard of protection, you get, of course, more losses, right? You get about 20% more losses from that perspective. If you now start to say, okay, I want to invest more money in protecting myself better, you can, for example, try to increase the standard of protection by 20%. You get a loss reduction of only 10% about. So it's not, so you understand the asymmetry. If you just decrease for the protection, you have more losses, right? Plus 20%. But if you increase the standard of protection, you only get a 10% reduction. You actually need to move to 150 years to have something that is about 20% reduction, right? So it's there is a cost, of course, to increase basically the protection. But of course, you can quantify the benefit with this perspective. For example, the benefit of moving from 100 to 150 could be, in this case, 75,000, right? So that's basically a quantified number, and you can start to discuss, basically the benefit is the following. You can really start to discuss with the risk engineer if this is necessary to do that, if this is a good value to do this. Of course, in terms of an insurance company, it's offering, I would say, a different perspective, different kind of discussion with their clients in this case. But I would say in terms of really the discussion, we start now to be able to use this modeling in a more informed way. It's not only just preventing or transferring the risk transfer, the financial resilience measure. It's really about really understanding what is the benefit of changing something in the equation. I just want to mention one thing is that when I talk about cost-benefit analysis, the model will only provide the benefit component. The cost, of course, we leave that to the engineer. They have to decide what is basically the protection they want to put in place, which kind of defense protection, if this is a pump, if this is a dam, whatever, increasing the standard. So that's morely about the benefit. So I think talking about Romania, I think it's okay. You noted it's not in the model today because it's a model now we are trying to expand in further places in Europe. And yesterday, actually, I was a bit late seeing my presentation to Daniela because I was just building those last few slides, trying to give a bit of a flavor how this could translate into potential use for the country, or basically answering the question if this is something we could do tomorrow in Romania if we extend this framework to the country. So I would say yes, 95%. It's something that we have all the framework in place, I would say. You see, Romania, you have very specific peril anatomy, I would say, in terms of the flood risk. You have also severe flash flooding, so it's important to start the model with precipitation. This is what I said. There is also a snow melt component because, I mean, 30% of the country is really mountainous actually. So and the rest is all with hills as well. So that's basically one of the main elements we need to capture. We are working on the flood-induced landslides. It's not in the model today, but for other territories, this is a component a bit more tricky to do, but we are starting to do that. But most importantly, I think we started to build with this pan-European event set this view at continental scale, and we capture mostly one important feature for Romania is Danube, right? Because I think a large proportion of Romania is in the Danube River basin. So that's basically one solution that is capturing already the correlation with Danube for all the other countries. So it's just a matter of extending, I would say, this domain. You see the map a bit bigger here. Oops, sorry. Between Vienna and the rest of Europe, and you see that. So that's if you want the peak flow correlation, or we would say the flood risk correlation between the city of Vienna and the rest of Europe. And you see that, okay, a part of this correlation is driven by the meteorology, by the rain pattern, if you want, but a large portion you can recognize is driven also by the river system, right? So that's basically a very important feature. Another element I was also just looking at is a bit about the different type of risks you have in Romania, and it's clear that in terms of modeling flood there, we have to take into account of the different building stocks and the different kind of buildings there. One of the features that may be very interesting to model in terms of the building resilience or vulnerability is, of course, the traditional house that is still pretty important. And it's clear that if you have a house with adobe infills, for example, that needs to be subjected to flood, it needs to be defined extremely accurately in the vulnerability model. For example, if there is a presence of a foundation, or it could change the flood risk. The inundation duration, of course, if you have a longer flooding for the mud bricks, it's different because it could lead to complete collapse of buildings, as you have seen in 2005. I think I've seen pretty impressive picture. The velocity, the contamination as well is important, depending on the heating system. If there is an oil heating system in place, for example, the walls are contaminated, it's much more costly to basically decontaminate. So all these kind of features are things we have to take care about in the model, but this is things I would say it's not things that we can do because we do it in a different way in different countries. So we have basically the engineering information. One thing I forgot to mention is the fact that with this kind of more complex framework, we are also able to mimic or basically to model the behavior at single risk a bit more accurately than in the past. Because now with this framework, without going too much into detail, we are able to compute the probability of having a complete loss versus no losses. Before, the uncertainty distribution in the model, it's a bit technical, but was basically giving you some distribution between those two extremes, but was very bad to model those extremes. For example, it was very bad in the model to model the complete destruction of a building, the complete losses. So with this framework, now we can do this. And of course, this kind of features, if there is a full collapse, it's important to be able to capture the full collapse of a building. So I would say with this kind of just view, it's interesting. I hope in this discussion later today, we can have more discussion with the industry in a sense that if we have all those kind of factor to create in the model, we could of course extend this kind of cost-benefit analysis also to Romania. And I think this is interesting because I've seen some news about different projects in Romania, of course, including some EU funding, of course, to improve the resiliency of Romania. And this is a way actually to better understand where to invest the money in complement to other measures. Okay, so just to wrap up this quick presentation, I just want to say that traditionally Cad models have been used, I would say, to something more extending our view beyond history to price, insurance or reinsurance. But now you've seen that with this kind of new technology, the model is modeling really some kind of a real representation of the flood processes. We can play around with the different components. We can change different components together. This is something we can discuss this afternoon further in the workshop. And it's interesting to understand we can start to play around with this tool. It's not only just a pricing tool, it's actually a research tool and a planning tool as well. And I hope I basically open your view a bit about what we can do in this kind of cost-benefit analysis. For me, it's a very interesting way to see a Cad model beyond just a pricing tool. And this is obviously a first way we can link, I would say, financial resilience with physical resilience and have a discussion with the engineers on the ground. With that, I just want to thank you.